June 5th, 1947, Harvard University. Secretary of State George C. Marshall stands before a graduating class and delivers a 17-minute speech that will reshape the global order. He proposes $17 billion, roughly $200 billion in today's dollars, to rebuild Europe. This is the Marshall Plan, the largest foreign aid program in history. The program credited with saving Europe from starvation, preventing communist takeover, and creating the foundation for European integration. But here's what the speech doesn't say. American corporations are sitting on a mountain of surplus goods with nowhere to sell them. The U.S. economy, which boomed during the war, is facing a potential recession. European markets, historically America's largest trading partners, are broke. They can't buy American products. And without exports, American factories will close and unemployment will rise. The Marshall Plan solves this problem. The aid isn't a gift, it's a business deal. And like all business deals, it benefits both parties, but one side writes the contract. This is the story of how the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, and how it locked Europe into an American economic and military orbit for the next 70 years. By 1947, 2 years after World War II ended, Europe is in ruins. Industrial production is at 88% of 1938 levels. Agricultural output is 83%. Exports have collapsed to 59% of pre-war levels. Germany, once the industrial engine of Europe, is producing at roughly half of 1938 capacity. Millions are unemployed. Food shortages are widespread. The winter of 1946 to 47 is brutal. Coal shortages mean factories close. People freeze in their homes. Riots break out in France and Italy. Britain, the supposed victor, is bankrupt. The war cost Britain $120 billion. By 1947, Britain has burned through its gold reserves and cannot pay for imports. In August 1947, Britain tries to make the pound convertible to dollars, a requirement of the 1945 Bretton Woods Agreement. It triggers a run on British reserves. Britain loses $1 billion in 6 weeks and abandons convertibility. The pound is trapped. France is politically unstable. The French Communist Party, the largest in Western Europe, holds 26% of parliamentary seats. In French elections in 1946, communists and socialists combined won 51% of the vote. The French government is fragile. Strikes paralyze the country. Italy faces similar problems. The Italian Communist Party holds 19% of seats. Communist-led unions control key industries. The economy is stagnant. Unemployment is over 10%. Across Western Europe, communist parties are surging. Why? Because people are starving. When you can't feed your family, ideology doesn't matter. You'll vote for whoever promises bread. The United States watches this with alarm, not because of humanitarian concern, though that exists, but because of cold strategic calculation. Here's what's driving American policy in 1947: fear. The U.S. economy produced roughly half of the world's industrial output in 1945. American GDP in 1948 is $258 billion. American factories ramped up production during the war and haven't scaled back. But Europe, America's traditional export market, cannot buy anything. European countries have no dollars. Their currencies are worthless. Their gold reserves are depleted. They cannot import. This creates a dollar gap. Europe needs to import to rebuild, but Europe cannot export enough to earn the dollars to pay for imports. By 1947, Europe's trade deficit with the United States is $5 billion annually. This is unsustainable. American policymakers fear a repeat of the Great Depression. In 1946 to 47, the U.S. economy briefly contracts. Corporate executives and economists warn that without European markets, American exports will collapse, factories will close, and unemployment will surge. This isn't abstract concern. This is the CEOs of major corporations, many of whom hold government positions, warning that their businesses need customers. W. Averill Harriman of Union Pacific Railroad, who will administer the Marshall Plan, knows that railroads need goods to ship. Edward Stettinius Jr. of U.S. Steel knows that European reconstruction means selling American steel. James Forrestal of Dillon Read Investment Bank knows that European recovery means profitable loans. These men aren't just advisors, they're in the room designing policy. The Marshall Plan emerges from this intersection: humanitarian concern, anti-communist strategy, and corporate self-interest. Marshall's speech at Harvard is deliberately vague. He doesn't specify dollar amounts. He doesn't name countries. He says the U.S. will help Europe if Europe comes up with a plan itself. This is strategic. Marshall knows that if the U.S. dictates terms, it looks like imperialism. If Europeans request aid and design their own recovery plan, it looks like partnership. On July 12, 1947, 16 European nations meet in Paris. They draft a recovery plan requesting $22 billion over 4 years. Truman cuts this to $17 billion and sends it to Congress. The Soviet Union is invited. This isn't generosity, it's political theater. The U.S. knows Stalin will refuse. Stalin does. He calls it economic imperialism. He orders Poland and Czechoslovakia, both initially interested, to reject the plan. Czechoslovakia's refusal is particularly painful. The Czech government wanted Marshall aid. Stalin forced them to decline. A Soviet-backed coup overthrows the Czech government in February 1948, installing a communist regime. This coup terrifies Western Europe and strengthens support for the Marshall Plan in the U.S. Congress. By April 1948, Congress passes the Economic Cooperation Act. Truman signs it on April 3, 1948. The Marshall Plan officially begins. Congress appropriated roughly $17 billion over the program's planned 4-year life. But the program ended early, merged into the Mutual Security Act in 1951 as Cold War priorities shifted toward rearmament. The total actually distributed $13.3 billion. Here's where it gets interesting. The Marshall Plan isn't cash handouts. The United States creates the Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA, to run the program. The ECA doesn't give money to European governments. Instead, the ECA buys American goods, food, fuel, machinery, raw materials, and ships them to Europe. European governments don't get the goods for free. They sell the goods to their own citizens and businesses. Europeans pay in local currency. That local currency is deposited in special counterpart funds at each country's central bank. These counterpart funds can only be spent with ECA approval. 60% must be invested in industry. 40% can be used for debt reduction or currency stabilization. This structure does 3 things. First, it guarantees that Marshall Plan dollars are spent on American products. Out of the $13.3 billion distributed between 1948 and 1952, here's where it goes. $3.5 billion on raw materials, $3.2 billion on food, feed, and fertilizer, $1.9 billion on machinery and vehicles, $1.6 billion on fuel. Almost all of this is purchased from American suppliers. American companies are paid in dollars by the ECA. American exporters boom. American factories stay open. The feared post-war recession doesn't happen. U.S. exports to Europe multiply. Second, it gives the United States enormous leverage over European economic policy. Want Marshall Plan aid? Open your markets. Reduce tariffs. Coordinate with your neighbors. Adopt American production methods. The ECA doesn't just fund recovery. It reshapes European economic structures. Third, it creates dependency. European recovery requires ongoing access to American goods, American loans, and American markets. This dependency becomes permanent. Between 1948 and 1952, $13.3 billion is distributed. The largest recipients: United Kingdom, $3.2 billion, 24%. France, $2.7 billion, 20%. West Germany, $1.4 billion, 11%. Italy, $1.5 billion, 11%. Netherlands, $1.1 billion, 8%. Britain and France get the most not because they need it most. Germany and Italy were far more destroyed, but because they're politically critical. Britain anchors the Atlantic Alliance. France must be kept from going communist. Marshall Plan aid represents roughly 2 to 3% of GDP for recipient countries. This sounds small, but it's targeted at critical bottlenecks: coal, steel, transportation infrastructure. Removing these constraints allows much larger domestic investment to flow. Importantly, the aid includes technical assistance. Over the program's 4 years, 6,000 European engineers, managers, and union leaders visit the United States to study American production methods. American advisors travel to Europe. The goal isn't just to rebuild Europe, it's to remake Europe using American business practices. Between 1948 and 1952, Western Europe experiences the fastest growth in its history. Industrial production increases 35%. Agricultural output exceeds pre-war levels. By 1952, every participating country's GDP surpasses 1938 levels. For all Marshall Plan recipients, output in 1951 is at least 35% higher than in 1938. Unemployment falls. Living standards rise. Communist parties decline. In the 1948 Italian elections, the Christian Democrats, backed by massive U.S. and Catholic Church intervention, defeat the communists. France's communists lose support as the economy stabilizes. Western Europe remains in the American orbit. But here's where economists and historians disagree. How much of this recovery was caused by the Marshall Plan? Some economists argue the Marshall Plan was decisive. Barry Eichengreen and Mark Uzan, in a 1992 study, find that Marshall aid provided a critical margin that allowed European recovery to accelerate. Without it, recovery would have been slower and more painful. Others are skeptical. The St. Louis Federal Reserve, in a 2021 analysis, notes that European trade balances don't match expectations. If Europe was capital-starved and relying on U.S. aid, you'd expect to see large trade deficits, Europe importing more than it exported. Instead, many Marshall Plan countries ran trade surpluses. Europe was exporting more than it imported, suggesting capital wasn't the binding constraint. Charles Kindleberger, one of the Marshall Plan's architects, admitted in later years, "It may never be possible to form a judicious estimate of the plan's impact." The consensus among economic historians is this: recovery was already beginning before the Marshall Plan. European production was rising. The plan accelerated recovery, removed bottlenecks, and provided confidence. But it didn't create recovery from nothing. What the Marshall Plan definitely did, it prevented the collapse of European currencies, financed critical imports during the dollar gap, and, crucially, it reshaped European economic structures to integrate with the American-led global economy. The Marshall Plan came with strings attached. Recipient countries had to open their markets to American goods, reduce tariffs and trade barriers, coordinate economic policies with neighbors through the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, accept American oversight of how counterpart funds were spent, adopt policies promoting free markets and private enterprise. Some of these were beneficial. European economic integration eventually led to the European Economic Community and today's European Union. Breaking down trade barriers increased efficiency. But other conditions locked Europe into subordination. The most important string, military integration. On April 4, 1949, 1 year after the Marshall Plan begins, 12 countries sign the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO. The timing is not coincidental. NATO is described in internal State Department memos as a military Marshall Plan, or military ERP, European Recovery Program. The economic aid comes with a security guarantee and a security obligation. Europe accepts U.S. military protection. In exchange, Europe aligns its defense policies with the United States. NATO's Article 5 states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This sounds like mutual defense. In practice, it means U.S. troops stationed permanently in Europe, U.S. nuclear weapons deployed on European soil, and European military forces integrated under U.S. command structures. The Marshall Plan and NATO together create a system where Europe's economic recovery depends on access to American markets, and Europe's security depends on American military power. This is not occupation. Europe chose this arrangement. But it's also not independence. France tries to maintain autonomy. Charles de Gaulle later withdraws France from NATO's integrated military command in 1966, arguing that France should not be subordinate to American strategic decisions. France returns in 2009, after the Cold War ends. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov calls the Marshall Plan dollar imperialism. He's not entirely wrong. The Soviet critique goes like this. The United States uses economic aid to gain political control over European economies. Marshall Plan recipients must open their markets, adopt American business practices, and align politically with Washington. The aid creates dependency. European recovery becomes contingent on continued American support and access to American markets. Molotov accuses the U.S. of dividing Europe into antagonistic camps. By offering aid only to non-communist states and requiring recipients to coordinate through the OEEC, the U.S. creates an economic bloc opposed to the Soviet sphere. Stalin forbids Eastern European countries under Soviet control from participating. This has consequences. Czechoslovakia wants the aid. Stalin forces them to reject it. Poland wants it. Stalin says no. These countries' economies suffer while Western Europe recovers. The Soviet Union offers an alternative. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, ComEcon, established in 1949. But ComEcon is weak. The Soviet economy is itself devastated by the war. Eastern Europe gets limited Soviet aid and faces Soviet extraction of resources as reparations. Eastern Europe's recovery lags far behind the West. By 1950, two Europes exist: a prosperous West tied to American markets and security guarantees, and a struggling East subordinate to Soviet control. Was the Marshall Plan imperialism? Pragmatic self-interest? Genuine humanitarianism? The honest answer: all three. The U.S. provided real aid. Millions of Europeans received food, fuel, and goods that prevented starvation and suffering. Marshall personally believed in rebuilding Europe to prevent another war. Truman genuinely feared that economic chaos would lead to extremism, as it had in the 1930s. Humanitarian motives existed, but those motives coexisted with hard strategic and economic interests. U.S. corporations profited enormously. American exports surged. The feared post-war recession didn't happen. Marshall Plan spending kept American factories running. Companies like U.S. Steel, Union Pacific, and countless manufacturers sold billions in goods to Europe, paid for by U.S. taxpayers. Strategically, the plan contained Soviet expansion. Communist parties lost support. Western Europe aligned with the U.S. NATO formalized this alignment. The plan created a Western bloc that would oppose the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades. And yes, it established American dominance. Europe became economically dependent on American markets and militarily dependent on American protection. The Bretton Woods system, created in 1944, made the dollar the world's reserve currency. The Marshall Plan cemented this. Global trade increasingly ran through dollar-denominated markets controlled by American financial institutions. Critics call this neocolonialism, domination without direct occupation. Defenders call it enlightened self-interest. The U.S. helped Europe because European prosperity served American interests. Both are correct. The Marshall Plan accomplished its goals. Economic recovery. Western Europe rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Political stability. Communist parties declined, democracies consolidated. European integration. The OEEC laid groundwork for the European Union. Atlantic Alliance. NATO formed the backbone of Western defense. American dominance. The U.S. became the undisputed leader of the Western world. But the plan also created dependencies that persist to this day. Europe's security still relies on NATO and American military power. European economies remain deeply integrated with American markets. The dollar remains the global reserve currency. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, Europe feels it. When American markets crash, Europe crashes. This isn't conspiracy, it's structure. The Marshall Plan built a system where American prosperity and European prosperity are intertwined, with the U.S. holding more cards. The plan's architects understood this. They designed it this way. George Kennan, head of State Department policy planning, explicitly argued that the goal was to create a Europe integrated with American economic and security structures. This wasn't hidden, it was policy. Today, the Marshall Plan is remembered as pure generosity. Politicians invoke it constantly. We need a Marshall Plan for X. The implication: selfless American aid solved European problems. This sanitized version erases the self-interest, the economic motives, the political strings, and the strategic calculation. It also erases European agency. Europeans weren't passive recipients. They negotiated, they demanded concessions, they shaped the program. Britain resisted some American demands. France pushed for policies serving French interests. Germans rebuilt using Marshall funds, but also their own initiative. The plan worked because it aligned interests. Americans got markets, security, and influence. Europeans got aid, stability, and recovery. Both sides benefited. That's not charity. It's a deal. Was it a good deal? For Western Europe, yes. Recovery was real. Living standards rose. Democracy survived. The alternative, economic collapse, political chaos, potential communist takeover, would have been far worse. For the United States, definitely yes. American dominance of the post-war order, economic, political, military, was secured. The cost was $13.3 billion. The return was global hegemony. For Eastern Europe, the deal was catastrophic. Excluded from Marshall aid, subordinated to Soviet control, Eastern Europe stagnated for 40 years. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the economic gap between East and West was enormous. It remains today. Every few years, someone proposes a new Marshall Plan for some crisis. A Marshall Plan for the Middle East, a Marshall Plan for Africa, a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, a Marshall Plan for climate change. None of these happen. Why? Because the Marshall Plan succeeded under unique conditions that no longer exist. Unipolar power. In 1948, the U.S. was the only major economy left standing. It produced half the world's industrial output. No competitor existed. Today, China, the EU, and others contest American dominance. Recipient capacity. Europe in 1948 had educated populations, intact legal systems, and industrial experience. It wasn't developing from zero, it was rebuilding. Many proposed Marshall Plans target regions without this foundation. Security umbrella. NATO provided military security that allowed economic integration. Without security, investment won't flow. Afghanistan and Iraq got massive U.S. aid, more in total than the Marshall Plan, but without stable security, the money was wasted. Aligned interests. The Marshall Plan worked because American and European interests aligned. Europeans wanted recovery. Americans wanted stable markets and anti-communist bulwarks. Both goals required the same policies. Modern crises rarely have such clear alignment. Congressional support. The Marshall Plan passed Congress with bipartisan support. The foreign policy establishment, business community, labor unions, and public opinion aligned. Isolationists opposed it, but they were outnumbered. Today's polarized politics make large foreign aid programs nearly impossible. The Marshall Plan succeeded not because America was generous, but because America was strategic. It spent $13.3 billion to secure markets, contain communism, and establish global dominance. It worked. Could such a program succeed today? Only if a major power, the US, China, or a coalition, had both the resources and the strategic incentive to make it work, and only if recipients had the capacity to use the aid effectively. The conditions that made the Marshall Plan possible, American hegemony, European state capacity, aligned interests, and political will, may not exist again. The Marshall Plan is a reminder that foreign aid is never purely humanitarian. It always serves the donor's interests. That doesn't make it immoral. Interests can align with good outcomes. But it does require honesty. The plan rebuilt Europe. It also locked Europe into American orbit. Both things are true. The plan fed millions. It also enriched American corporations. Both things are true. The plan prevented communist takeover. It also established American dominance. Both things are true. Understanding history requires seeing both sides. The Marshall Plan wasn't American generosity saves Europe. It wasn't American imperialism enslaves Europe. It was a deal with unequal power, a deal that benefited both parties, a deal where one side wrote most of the terms. Europe rebuilt, America dominated, the Soviet Union lost. That was the deal. The Marshall Plan shows how economic aid, strategic interests, and corporate profits intersect in ways that shape the world for decades. We post breakdowns like this weekly. Subscribe if you don't want to miss them.